Hi Sarah, how are you? Thank you for joining me here today. It's a really good opportunity to talk a bit about better streets, about a lot of the work that you've been doing as an urban shaper. And I'd absolutely love to start, if I could, by finding a bit about your history, what's brought you to this point. I think that always kind of frames a lot of people's perception of the world around them. And I was really intrigued to see that you'd spent a lot of time growing up in Papua New Guinea, which is an area I know quite well from my previous job. So tell me a bit about your early years, your upbringing.
Yeah, so my parents were doctors, both my mum and my dad, in Papua New Guinea. So we moved there just before they had independence in 1975. And then we lived there till I was nearly 9 years old and then moved to Perth in WA. And yeah, it definitely was formative years for me. I think in part being a minority, being a white person but in a minority, went to an international school, but had a real exposure to a lot of different cultures, different ways of thinking. The Papua New Guineans are very much animistic, so they believe in their ancestors coming to visit them. I lived next door to Trobriand Islanders, so they're a matrilineal society. So yeah, it was an incredible childhood to grow up into.
Fantastic. It was in Moresby?
In Madang, which is on the north coast.
Been to Madang too. It's a fantastic area. No, that's wonderful. Would you say that there is anything, looking back now, that you have brought into your current work and your current kind of view of how we can live differently and ideally better, that you've brought from that experience of growing up in Moresby, or not Moresby, sorry, in Madang?
I think, yeah, that's an interesting question. So we had a very, very free and independent movement around. The only rule we had was we had to be home by dark, and if we weren't, my mum would call out the window, and they use you've heard of the bush telegraph, and so other people through the village would hear the name and you just automatically call it out and pass the name on, and you're sort of at dusk and come home. And I think the other one was, I remember getting my first bicycle there, so I couldn't buy a bicycle there, but we were on holidays overseas and bought me a bike, and Dad covered in rust-proof paint, and that's where I learned to ride a bike. But I think there are other aspects as well. Nobody there is car dependent. People don't own their own car, so you're very reliant on walking everywhere or catching the PMVs, the public motor vehicles. And so, yeah, it probably did give me a very, very different perspective on what it is to be living within a society. I think also being exposed to both the Papua New Guinean way of being and going to an international school, my friends from all over around the world. And it was a massive, massive culture shock to move to Australia, to a suburban lifestyle in Perth. It was like a complete opposite.
So that was going to be my next question, is moving to Perth must have been quite traumatic almost.
It was, yeah.
It's a very different place. Even in 1975-ish, I imagine that it would have been just... What was your strongest, I guess, perception of that difference? What was the first thing that struck you?
Lonely. It was really lonely, moving from a place where I could just step outside the door and there's hundreds of kids to play with instantly, and you could just go for a swim because we're right on the waterfront, and suddenly I'm in a house that is separate from anyone else. You've got to seek permission to go and see friends. It was just bizarre. So I felt incredibly isolated and lonely moving to a suburban location in Perth.
So did your parents carry with them some of the kind of Australian views of what you should be allowed to do and shouldn't be allowed to do as a kid in an Australian city with them from before they went to Papua New Guinea? Or was there a bit of an element of, well, Sarah's always gone and played in the streets and played in the neighbourhood, and why would we now suddenly treat that any differently when we're in an Australian city?
I've never thought about that. I guess my understanding is when they moved to Papua New Guinea, they questioned everything. They were very, very Christian before then. They attended church, did Bible studies and so on. I think they met through church, and they gave all of that up when they went to Papua New Guinea. and they claim because the sermons were very long, but I think that, so I think they probably had to give up a lot of their ways of thinking in an Australian context in order to really understand and fit into Papua New Guinea. I remember my mum saying things like, yeah, the first time a teacher had died and the kids all came from the school and filed past the dead body of the teacher in order to say goodbye. You would never have that in an Australian context. So I think they had to change their own perspectives hugely in order to fit into that culture in Papua New Guinea.
So in a sense, looking at things through non-traditional eyes has almost been something that you've had your whole life.
Yeah, well, I would argue it's actually through much more traditional eyes,
Yes,
as in the way we have
100%.
tended to live in the past.
Yeah.
And in fact, what we've had to adjust to in the modern world is the modern way of life.
Completely agree. Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, in a sense, that's the thing that is strange for us in the so-called West, is that people kind of see that there are these unwritten rules and these ways that things get done. And because it's been for several generations, now people have stopped going and saying, well, you know, is that the only way you can do things? So I find that interesting. We could go on about that for ages. But I guess moving on from there, tell us a little bit about what happened to Sarah to bring you to where you are now in 2025. What's been the path? What do you do now? What are you doing? You know, the story.
Yeah, sure. So I guess after high school, so I actually started university at the age of 16.
Mm-hmm.
I skipped a couple of grades at school. And if I could go back now, I think I'd tell that young child to take a year or two off before starting university, but I didn't really know what else to do. So I studied architecture, I became a registered architect, did an MBA, so it was following a pretty traditional career path, but it wasn't until, so I worked in a number of architecture roles, thought I'd do property finance, but didn't enjoy that.
Yep.
And then I guess in my early to mid 30s, I landed a role at Infrastructure Australia. That was 2008. And that was right, I think I was the second or third employee to start at Infrastructure Australia in the Australian government. It was called the Major Cities Unit.
Mm-hmm.
And our job was to basically, my title was Director of National Urban Policy. So it was really to write the first ever national urban policy for Australia. And it was just the best job in the world. It was just amazing, and working with an incredible high caliber people, surrounded by not just within our own organisation, which was only about 12 staff then, but also having incredible women leaders across industry organisations, from the Planning Institute through to the Green Building Council and so on. And they really just created a cadre of leadership about how things could be done better and how you could work in a really cooperative way to get better things done. So it was a really idealistic time. And so I spent 6 years there, and in addition to writing the urban policy, wrote the first ever national active transport policy that was released by Albanese when he was the Deputy Prime Minister, as well as the first ever urban design protocol. So it was really sort of setting some national benchmarks around how things could best be done. And then I went on to...
What years are we talking here?
So that was 2008 through to 2014. So sort of after the Rudd-Gillard-Rudd into the Abbott era. And then Abbott closed the Major Cities Unit. So I then, yes. So I then went on to working in local government at Waverley Council, and then state government at Transport for New South Wales. And then now I've sort of moved more into the private sector. I've just set up a small business with a couple of colleagues called Vivendi Consulting, and doing things that we just absolutely love on how do we create better places for people.
So I guess that brings us to the fundamental question of, as a consultant, you're looking at creating better streets as the organisation you head, but more broadly, more livable cities. So I think your title on your LinkedIn is Urban Shaper, which I love. So if you were looking at the things that our cities are fundamentally not delivering on at the moment, which are the easiest things for to be achieved, the easiest things to tackle? What would be the low-hanging fruit that people should really tackle to bring our cities as quickly as possible into being more livable?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So when I was in the major cities unit, that was the fundamental question we had to ask is how do we make our tagline was livable, productive, sustainable cities. But the question we really struggled with is, okay, well, what can we do? What ought we do that is very focused on an urban issue, so it's not an Australia-wide issue? What matters within the city's context? 75% of our population lives within a major city, and so what I found, the things that I could do something about, or and if you go and ask people on the street what matters to you in this sort of urban environment, what matters to them is housing and how they get around. So housing and transport, they're the two sort of touch points that matter to people in their kind of built environment context. From housing perspective, it's how do I afford to live in a place that I love, that I feel comfortable with, that I can raise a family, have my partner, etc. And then when it comes to moving around, we tend to fixate on that being about the car, but it's actually not about the car. It's about how do I get from A to B, how do I go and live the lifestyle that I want to live, and then how do I just enjoy myself and have fun. You know, we're living here to have fun and have joy and spend time with people. So for me, that ended up being, well, okay, well, that's why we need to have a national urban design protocol, because we need to understand at a national level what makes great places. What are the fundamental, it's welcoming, it's a place that you enjoy spending time in, it's accessible for people of all ages and abilities, those sorts of things. And then from a transport perspective, giving people real options. So around 35% of our population can't drive. Either they're too young, or they're too old, or they're living with a disability, or they can't afford a car. And so how are we providing for people to have options to get around? And I think they're the fundamental things we need to address in order to make places really livable and lovable for people.
And look, well, the thing that strikes me as being quite intriguing around transport is that some of the greatest opponents of going and expanding alternative transport to mocars are motorists. And you try to explain to them that if you've got people who can and need to, as you point out, use alternative forms of transport, aren't on the roads, your life as a motorist actually becomes vastly more pleasant as well. You're going to have more space on roads. We know that if you want to go and have more congestion, widen roads. That whole, the whole unintuitive or counterintuitive, the counterintuitive things about a lot of road design is make them bigger and motorists will have a better experience, but we know the opposite turns out to be the case. So I find that really interesting. One of the things that strikes me about you identifying the two key areas that we can do most quickly some really constructive things with as being housing and transport. In Europe, a lot of the cities there have really so much better solutions in those two areas than Australia does. When it comes to housing, you look at places like Vienna where you've got the vast majority of people live in really high quality, publicly provided accommodation. They rent in security and their lives are good and they're not in a struggling situation for housing. You go to cities like Amsterdam or Scandinavian countries, and the way that people approach transport, very few people have cars. There's not much need for a car, and their personal experience of going from A to B is perfectly fine, despite the fact that the weather is often dodgy, by going and cycling or using public transport or walking and so on. Why has Australia ended up being in such a different place to cities? We've got the examples out there. I don't understand why Australia is making the mistakes and then doubling down on them.
Yeah, I think there's probably a range of reasons for that. Partly is the background to our suburban development here in Australia is largely, not all, most of your inner city areas predate motor cars. But anything that's built between the two world wars and onwards really would have been built on the assumption that people will get around with a car. And if you think about cities prior to then, in the sort of pre-World War one of the biggest issues in cities was horse dung was everywhere. And so when you come along with a car that's petrol powered, not dung powered, it's going to be cleaner for our streets. And people, weren't thinking and worrying about motor exhaust then. Um, but then some countries, like in the Netherlands, they found that they were killing too many children, and so they had the kindermoord, or children being killed, was the rally cry. And then I think also other cities in Europe were building to become more car dependent up until the oil crisis in the 70s. And they realised that we've got a choice to make. Whereas in Australia, and in the US, and probably in the UK, really doubled down on, we're going to keep our Anglosphere view of the world and keep expanding the suburbs and having bigger cars. So one of the things I've done in my day job is to really look at what makes places walkable, because walking is the fundamental indicator of what makes a good place.
Yeah.
And what we've found is that the type of housing that you build, the type of development you have, has a huge impact on whether or not people walk. So if you've got 100 people on the street, 55 of them can be explained through 3 or 4 key factors. And those are basically that there's a relatively low percentage of single detached houses. So your sort of suburban lot is not conducive to walking at all. If you've got less than 30%, it doesn't matter. They could be duplexes, semi-detached terrace houses, and so on. It doesn't really matter what that type is, as long as they're not single detached dwellings. The other one is mixed land use, so you can walk to some local shops, you can go to a GP, go to a local school, go to a post office, and so on. Those things matter because it's mixed use. It gives you lots of things to see and do. And then the third element is your intersection density. Urbanists call it permeability, but it basically means fairly small, tight grid size of your street blocks. Those 3 things explain about 55% of all walking. And the problem is that if you think about most suburbs outside of the inner city core, they don't meet those criteria.
No.
And so it makes it impossible to live without a car in that sort of circumstance. So we've baked that into the very fabric of our city. And so it's not fair to expect people to give up a car in that type of environment, because we've caused a car dependent type of environment. And that's a historical artifact. And I totally get that we shouldn't be expecting people to give up their car. But what we do need to do is create we have to retrofit back into those areas, like the transit-oriented developments and things like that, to give people the possibility of living without being as dependent on the car as they are today.
And it strikes me that the initiative that to some degree was being forced upon the federal government in this term that's just finishing now was to build X number of new homes. Now, yes, there are some apartments being built. There is rezoning of some areas around public transport hubs and other kind of things in some fairly controversial kind of decisions around that zoning question. But then you've got an enormous number of, at least when I look on TV, there's an enormous number of places being built as quarter-acre blocks on the outskirts of cities. There's complaints going in that there's not sufficient services in terms of transport, in terms of schools and shops, and people are moving out into what is socially a desert in these areas, and yet they keep building them and building them and building them. Should we be banning that kind of building and saying, no, 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 this is the wrong way to go? We've got to look at a way of actually contracting our cities and making sure we put the resources into services in areas that then start growing up in a denser kind of fashion closer into the city. I see you nod, so I think
I think banning might be a little strong, but at the moment we subsidise that enormously. So let's just think about the cost of doing that.
Yeah.
So to the buyer, person who's going to purchase that, it seems more affordable. But for that person, you're locking them into car dependency, not only for that individual, but they're going to have to be the mum and dad taxi. They're going to be lonely because they're isolated. Coming back to my experience of moving to a suburban location as a child, you're then meaning that person has to rely on the car, and the average household in Australia in that sort of circumstance is spending about 17% of their income on transport. That's about
17%. Oh my
17%.
God.
So that's about $25,000 per household is being spent on transport, of which the vast majority of that is on, I think only a very small proportion is on public transport. The vast majority of that in the sort of 20,000 plus category is
Those
on
cars.
tolls and
Oh yeah,
depreciation and
right.
petrol and so on. Now that is not that's not living affordability. The second component is, and let alone their time, if they're having to ferry kids to school, to
Yeah,
sport,
yeah.
and all those things that have locked into this car dependency. The other one is that when they go to, they need to give up their license eventually. They then, how do they live if they've got glaucoma or some other thing that's causing them not to be able to drive? The other component is the government has to subsidise those houses very substantially.
Yeah,
So Infrastructure Victoria has said they, off the top of my head, I think it's around $150,000 per home that they're subsidising. In New South Wales, it's in excess of 75,000 is the latest statistics I've seen. And so if Victoria is spending $500 million a year in subsidising expansion into the outer suburban areas that are car dependent, what if they flipped that and spent that $500 million on affordable housing instead? You know,
yes.
you'd get a very different outcome. And so, and the other thing is we've got this net zero requirement. So by 2050, we're meant to be at net zero. How someone who is locked into car dependency in a big house in a very far-flung location, how are they going to be net zero?
Yes.
They can't.
Yeah.
And so we're locking in this intergenerational dependency on cars that will never get to our net zero requirement that we need to get to. So I would say stop subsidizing it. And if anything, make it very difficult and expensive to be doing that. We shouldn't be subsidizing people to be living that type of lifestyle. We should be doing that urban infill instead around really good public transport and making sure we also build great amenities along with that, like pools and libraries and all, and great public spaces.
So what I'm hearing is that the Australian dream of a quarter acre block on increasing sprawl leads to increased cost down the track. So perhaps cheaper, perhaps not if it was in a smaller apartment or something in an urban area in terms of upfront cost, but then significantly greater cost down the track. Greater isolation at a time where we have a loneliness epidemic, and that's only going to get worse with age as the kids leave home and all those kind of things. It's awful for the environment on many levels in terms of getting to net zero and in terms of a reliance on individual motor vehicles and so on. The question leaps out, why are we still doing it? What is the counterforce that's seeing governments going and subsidising building of this type? I don't get it. Why is this happening? Why don't governments just go, this is ridiculous, it makes no sense whatsoever, it needs to stop?
I think I'm going to be really controversial here, but there is a very big lobby in some states more than others. Probably, I'll be frank, Western Australia probably has the strongest pressure on this, with a lobby group that benefits hugely from greenfield expansion. It's I can't remember the exact stuff set off the top of my head, but it used to be around about 90% of all homes in WA, in Perth, were built by the same three builders. And so there is a powerful force to push for that. I think also, to be if you've got this, we do have a housing crisis. We do need to build more homes. We do have a lot of population growth, and if it's easier to go and quicker to go and build that in greenfield lots, then I can understand the siren call of let's just build it and get it done. It is difficult to do infill because you've got you have to go through community consultation processes, you have to go through planning process and approvals, you get overshadowing, and the community complains, I think for good reason, because they often don't get the amenity. If you've got, say, a public pool shared amongst 40,000 people, you've now got to share that amongst 80,000 people, you are losing that amenity. And I think it's perfectly reasonable for people to be upset about that, because history says they'll be worse off. They often put that, express it in things like there'll be more traffic congestion. But ultimately, it's that loss of the good things they have in order to accommodate additional people. So I think that it has to be done really well. Density has to be done well.
Yeah.
And that's a tricky balance of things. You've got to be working with multiple levels of government, usually between local and state. Got a lot of parties involved. It's hard work to try and retrofit that, but it absolutely has to be done.
But is there a positive story to tell as well? So if you're in an area which at the moment is quarter acre blocks, but you're 50 metres walk from a railway station, and going and saying, look, some of these areas, if we put well designed, constructed, small to medium rise apartment blocks on these areas, it can be done in a way which minimises the negatives and provides you with some positives. So you actually won't be as lonely because there will be more people around. The concentration of people will mean that you'll have more and better quality services and shops and things. Some of the brands you may like to shop at will come to your area, whereas currently they're not, because there's more of a market. So it works in that way. You may get better public transport and more frequent public transport. You may get more investment from government into things like cycleways, roadways, not roadways, but cycleways and footpaths and green spaces, and the development could happen in a way that actually sees a counterbalance to that fact that, yes, there's maybe twice as many people at the local pool.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, yes, absolutely, all those things should happen. And there are some really, really great examples of that happening. I think City of Sydney is a great model for that. They do deliver on what they said they would do, and they work closely with developers around that, do a lot of strong master planning and so on. But I think for a lot of people, that's not been their experience.
Yeah.
And so when there are broken promises of that, that's when, people say, well, see, I told you so. That's what I was worried about, and it comes true. So it's, yes, you have to plan for it, but you also have to be proving that
Yes.
you can be reliable and will actually deliver on those things.
So rebuild of trust.
Yeah, you do have to build trust with the community that you'll deliver on what you said you would.
And look, your controversial statement before touched upon the fact that there are very strong lobby groups who are pushing for the freedom to be able to develop the way they want to do. Let's call them developers. Developers are developers. That's one of the elements of that. There's probably also the motoring lobbyists who actually want to see more cars on the road and more investment having to be put into those areas. So there's probably other lobby groups as well. If we were to counter that so that we start to make more livable, better shaped cities, which are better for people and people enjoy them more and have a better life, how do we go about changing the power structure that sees bad decisions being made as a result of these lobbyists?
So, as with many complex things, there's no single decision maker, and therefore there's no single body or organisation or lobby group to blame for any of this. But likewise, the solution doesn't lie with one or the other either. I think that let's just take a step back. When we were talking about the consequences of expanding greenfield, expanding into that sort of urban sprawl, the peri-urban growth areas and so on, which soak up a huge proportion of our population growth in Australia, to be fair. That requires us to then build lots of roads, and that then means that there's a huge amount of money that gets poured into road infrastructure.
Yeah.
So at the moment, the Australian government subsidises for the next 4 years. The budget showed up until whenever they release the next budget that they're going to be spending about $714 per person every year on road infrastructure. and 90 cents per person on active transport, on walking and cycling. So, like, just that's a 800% difference between the two. Why do we need to build more roads in Australia?
Yeah.
And that's being driven by this greenfield expansion. When you compare it to another country, Wales has been really exemplary on this. They've not only created a Future Generations Act, so you have to consider the well-being of future generations in decision making. They've then also got in their Carbon Reduction Act, we now have one, but we don't have a clear carbon budget that's sort of set on these 5-year cycles that they do in the UK. And what the Welsh Government did was said, look, we need to consider, if we've got this much budget for the next 5 years to spend on every activity that we do, a portion of that is for transport, and a portion of that, for every road you build, you can either get a kilometre of motorway or 500 kilometres of cycleways for your carbon budget that we've got left. So they ran a review of all of their road projects that were being proposed to see whether or not it would fit within their carbon budget and help them meet their Paris targets. And they then knocked back a whole lot of roads because it didn't meet these two acts' requirements. Now, we don't have that sort of discussion in Australia. We never have that sort of discussion in Australia because it is unquestionable that we need to build more roads.
Yes.
And so is that coming from some powerful lobby group? Probably not. I think it's just business as usual that we don't question. But I should hope that we start to move to a debate where we're saying, okay, we do have this legislation that requires us to meet net zero. Transport has been flatlining on its carbon, if not slightly growing, for the last 20 years on the amount of percentage of Australia's emissions. It's around 20%. We're going to make that get to zero. You can get to zero. We're not going to do that by only electric vehicles. They are not the solution. So if you look at the Australian Institute of Traffic Planning and Management did put out a paper recently that I helped co-author along with others. And it basically said we need to do things like have compact mixed-use urban development, so you avoid the need to travel by having things in close proximity. Then you shift your modes of the travel that you do need to do onto active and public transport. And then for all the trips that are unavoidable, that absolutely have to be done with a private vehicle, then you shift those to more sustainable fuels like electric. But you can't just keep doing business as usual and then flip all cars to electric and we're sold, because the problem is that roads have a huge amount of resources that go into them, water, all of the building materials that go into it, plus the carbon that's embodied in that. So the solution is multifaceted, but we do have to question some really basic things like how are we doing our urban development? We need to stop this type of development, do more of that type of development.
So one of the things you're saying is that a hurdle here is people's resistance to change. They have always done things a certain way, and there is a tendency of us to say, yes, this may make more sense, but I've always done it the other way, and it's never been disastrous for me, so if it's not broken, don't fix it. And I think in Australia a lot of people seem to think it's not broken, so we don't need to fix it. I think our discussion here today suggests it is broken, and it's going to get more and more broken, and the consequences are going to be more and more dire. The Greens have got a few policies that cross over into the areas we've been talking about. One of them is a sustainable cities project plan, which is really interesting. It talks about probably not enough, but $40 billion being provided to subsidise governments at state and local level over 10 years to go and make changes, to present ideas around sustainable change and to co-subsidise that. Potentially, oh hello, there's nice to get a little bit of life in our urban areas. Hello, Mr. Heineberg. And the sustainable, to have a policy that says we will actually put money into subsidising initiatives at this kind of level and to encourage governments. That's part of it. To also have put some structure in place so that there is a sustainable cities body that looks at developments and looks at potential changes to legislation and regulation and settings around subsidisation and tax and so on, to look at all of these areas. If there was $40 billion on the table and we said to you, Sarah, what are the first things that we should do with $40 billion to make the most difference as quickly as possible, what would be on your shopping list?
Oh, wow, that would be an awesome question. I like it. I think I would take a leaf out of Anne Hidalgo's book. Anne Hidalgo is the mayor of Paris. Mm-hmm. She's been very, very popular and controversial at the same time. But before we get to that, the first thing I would do is I'd say $40 billion over 10 years is not much in the scheme of things, because that is just 2 years of the roads budget for the Australian government, right, of which that is then matched again and again and again by the state governments. So Transport for New South Wales spends close to $1 billion a month on capital projects, of which the vast majority of that is roads. So I would say, in addition to the $40 billion that you're spending, I would then cut a whole lot of the budget of the road expansion agenda. And then the next thing I would do is, as I said, with Anne Hidalgo, what she did is she's gone to the communities around Paris and she said, we're very car dominated, and what we want to do, but a lot of people live in the sort of the 6-story flats and so on. So actually a proportion of the population, as with Australia, don't drive. So she went to communities and said, we're going to be getting rid of the car parking space outside your apartment building on the street. What would you like instead? You can have an outdoor dining, you can have a place to park your bike, you can have a tree, you can have gardens, a little play area, and the community gets to decide what they get. And you've seen they've rolled out wider footpaths as well. So, and they come in overnight. They don't worry about traffic control. They come in overnight or very early in the morning, and they literally, I've watched them in Paris, they come out and literally paint a wider footpath into the roadway, and people are using it within a couple of hours. So I would go for a very, very rapid transformation of the streets like that, because people will resist it up front. They're like, no way, this is going to be bad for my business. But once it's in there and people are using it, they love it.
Yes.
And we saw that during COVID. I was involved heavily with the pop-up cycleways and the Getting the Streets as Shared Spaces program in New South Wales, where we were funding local governments to put in outdoor dining and things like that. And if you go, some of those have been made permanent. If you went back to some of those places now and said, hey, we're going to take out this public space and we're going to put car parking back in, there'd be a huge riot.
And you can have a car parked in front of your thing, as an alternative. You'd be like, why the hell would I do that?
Exactly. But I think that's where often, so I like the idea of a tactical approach, because it's basically community consultation with a one-to-one scale test board.
Absolutely.
And then you can
it gets
tweak
people over change.
It gets
they
people,
feel they're
exactly,
being listened to.
yes. And then, but then you can tweak it, because sometimes people's feedback is genuinely useful. It's like, oh, well, actually, I can't get a pram past here, or actually, there's an elderly person living here and they can't get deliveries, or their carer can't arrive. That's fine. Then you tweak it and then you make it permanent. So that's what I would be doing, is really looking at how do we make our streets better. I'd also be looking at, trying to make sure we build a lot more affordable housing, really address those areas that are more socioeconomically deprived. I'd be looking at how you can get more public transport, more frequent, high-quality public transport services. But in order to do that, as I said, you need to flip the script on our road building and that car hegemony that's really taken over our streets and roads around Australia.
And I think that's where our Greens policy is sitting at the level that it is it's meant to be a fleshing up of the amount that you should be doing, taking money from other things like roads, taking money from other things like subsidising developers to build more urban sprawl, and then having to put in all of the works and things around all of that. Take that away, here's an extra 40 billion, and let's work from there. So I think it would be, required of governments to say, we have to do things differently. And I like the idea that you put forward around getting that consultation and getting the community involved in that, because if one of the biggest hurdles is change, then to get people to go, okay, so there's going to be change because we've been told it's not staying the way it is, so therefore what do we want that change to look like? And they can draw a picture of, you know, the tree or the dining area or the little park or something like that. So, you know, I guess that's quite interesting. Another area that we've talked about is expanding what the Labor government in Queensland did as a response to the Greens putting forward an election pitch to do this. Labor government said, well, we're going to do it and we're going to do it now before the election, was 50-cent public transport fares. Now, our proposal is that we will work with the states to deliver that countrywide, so everyone has 50-cent public transport fares. Is that, how much will that help? Is it the right policy? Is there a better policy when it comes to improving utilisation of public transport and therefore ideally returning our roads to pedestrians and cycles, because you need far less road space if you've got far less cars?
I'd love to be able to answer that question, but public transport is not my specialty.
Yeah.
So I actually going to say I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I guess philosophically, going and moving people away from the motor car and towards alternatives.
Yes, I totally support that.
Yeah.
I don't know whether the right fare component is around 50 cents, and my understanding is free is actually not a great idea. Would it then result in if it resulted in a reduction in public transport services? Excuse me, I'm going to just the flowers.
Yes, exactly. We're getting the hay feverish stuff
Yeah,
going
I've been
on.
getting this morning. Sorry, if reducing the fares resulted in there being less quality services,
Yes.
I think it would be counterproductive.
Yeah.
But if it's subsidised to an extent and that is going to be guaranteed to stay in place and improve public services and so on, public transport services, I would support that. I'd also say you'd probably want to be concentrating on the areas of need, the low socioeconomic areas. I live in the eastern suburbs of Sydney. Largely people in my area they're not going to be encouraged to use public transport more because it became cheaper, because it's already an affluent area and already has very high public transport use as it is. So I'd be sort of wanting to be a little bit more subtle about some of those things, but I think in principle it makes sense. Whatever we can do to get the shift, that was that avoid, shift, improve component, that is shifting people off driving into public transport, completely makes sense.
So I'm the Greens candidate in the election for Wentworth. If we're talking Wentworth, there is the so-called controversial, which I don't see as controversial at all, thing in Wentworth is the cycleway up Oxford Street. Let's start with that. Is that a good idea? Is that likely to help in terms of improving the shape of Wentworth for people who live in Wentworth?
Yeah, so I'm in the Wentworth electorate as well. I've been involved in that cycleway, getting it funded and built for quite a few years now. I think a few things around that. One is that you absolutely need high quality cycling infrastructure if you're going to get more people cycling. That's what Paris has been way more bullish on, that sort of stuff. So they got the Rue de Rivoli that was like 6 lanes of motorways, and you can barely move a car on there now. It's for buses and bikes and pedestrians. And so I actually disagree that that's been all that controversial. If you go and ask the Bondi Chamber of Commerce, I'm sure they'll say they fully support it now. It was controversial getting it through, but it's in there and people love it. I would say that it still needs more work. It needs to get all the way down to Bondi Beach, because that's actually where people want to get between Bondi Junction and Bondi Beach. And they need to still finish that section between Centennial Park and Taylor Square. When that's built, you'll have a huge increase in the number of people cycling on there. But the other thing that makes cycleways successful is you need to build a network around it so people can get to it easily. So if they've come on the cycleway, they can get to and from it easily. We have got some really great cycling infrastructure in the Wentworth area, particularly because Centennial Park literally acts as a hub for the hub and spoke sort of model of how that infrastructure works. And so we need to be building further off that.
So this idea that I've only ever seen in Sydney of half doing a cycleway and then it just stops in the middle of nowhere and then literally 2 blocks later starts again seems to be utterly bizarre, I've got to say, but also reflective of this start-stop, yes, no, this indecision around cycling. How do we get decisiveness when it comes to cycling facilities so that a city as large and wealthy as Sydney gives really good quality and safe opportunities for people to cycle?
So it needs probably 3 things. One is money. At the end of the day, if the federal government is only funding 90 cents a year per person for active transport and $700 plus for roads, you get the outcome that you paid for.
Yeah.
And exactly the same story is happening at the state level as well. Local government is different because they literally can't afford to do this. So it's reliant largely on the state and federal government. In my spare time, I'm the president of Better Streets Australia, which is basically a nationwide charity organisation where we're trying to work with communities right around Australia to create better street outcomes. Yeah. And with the federal election now, we are campaigning for the Australian government to increase that funding from 90 cents per person to $15 per person annually for 10 years. It would make a huge difference. Yeah. And we're saying it should be for the United Nations Decade of Sustainable Transport, which is from 2026 to 2036. And that funding would be, excuse me, that would be enough to fund, if it's then matched by state government funding, we would then build, so the four largest capital cities in Australia, so Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane and Perth, all are on the Infrastructure Australia's priority list, which basically they've gone through a process of being compared against all sorts of other projects, including WestConnex and NorthConnex and so on, that they are worthy of funding, but they're not funded. And that would mean that we would build a substantial network of cycleways throughout the Sydney area, and including in Wentworth as well. And so you'd build those 4 capital cities that have already been noted as of high merit by the Australian independent body. Then you'd also fund probably 15 to 20 regional cities. So Wagga Wagga is a really great example of New South Wales. They had $15 million. They built 55 kilometres of share path network, and 20% of commuters to work now use that to get to work.
Isn't that fantastic?
So you could fund those big capital cities, and then also do some other things like subsidising e-bikes, particularly for low-income earners. If you look at Belgium, they subsidise you about nearly 50 cents per kilometre just to ride to work. And then you would also fund a few other things like active travel to schools. Now for that spend, you'd get about $40 billion back to the economy for that investment, because you get a lot of health benefits from that, about 80% in health benefits. So people are happier, they're going to live longer for such a tiny investment in their lives. So that's what we're pushing for.
So why aren't we doing it?
I think part of it is political willpower. At the end of the day, these decisions have to be made at a political level that they're going to do that. The agencies will deliver if it's funded and they've been instructed to do so. So if the federal government said to the states, to New South Wales, we're going to offer you $2 billion to go and build that network if you match that $2 billion, you bet they will go and build it. And when you talked about those little missing links, that becomes part of the whole program, is to say you have to build the trunk infrastructure, the trunk routes, make sure that there are no gaps in that, and then the local governments can sort of do the infill on the smaller components. But fundamentally, that's the issue, is that we need to have the political willpower that we're just going to get it done.
So if the Greens were to win balance of power in the federal election, these are the kind of things that we could potentially do, is to go and say, right, this is a change that needs to be made, which has only ever lacked the political will to do it. So now, unless you've got a really good reason for not doing it, we need you to commit to this. that would be really interesting. And honestly, it'd be a drop in the ocean. By the sound of things, it actually won't even cost $15 a head. It'll cost nothing a head because the savings in terms of health and everything else will outpace that. So that's one key area.
So at about 5 to 1. So every dollar you spend, you'll get about $5 back.
Yeah, right. So you more than pay for it. So
Yes.
it's a good budget saving process is to go along this path. So if you were looking at Wentworth, are there maybe two other things that you would do as low-hanging fruit if, let's just say, all of a sudden Wentworth got the 40 billion, not worrying too much about the actual amount, but let's say you were focused on Wentworth, are there any other things in terms of trying to actually create a new urban environment where the people in that area are living a better life, are happier, are healthier, and are essentially wealthier because their ability to go and grow and exist in that economy are stronger as well? What would be a couple of other things that you would do?
I think I would probably, taking a leaf out of the book of the City of Sydney, I would spend a lot more on the public parks.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of the parks in the Wentworth area are fairly degraded. And so, they've got kind of slightly cheesy equipment for kids to play on. They sort of outgrow it by the age of 4 or 5. So I'd be doing those sorts of things, putting in things like pump tracks so that kids can practice. A pump track is a fairly small, tight bike track with gravel, but it's a way for kids in the 9 to 15-year-olds can actually learn and build their skills and confidence before they end up on the roads. I would put in more cycling infrastructure. I think the public transport is pretty good, but there are definitely pockets, particularly up towards Dover Heights, etc., that are really poorly served by public transport. And I would spend a lot more on improving the Bondi Beach area. It is inundated with tourists. It's extremely, if anyone who wants to come to Australia wants to go to Bondi Beach, they end up at the Bondi Junction train station. They pop out, find their way to the bus. I think a lot more could be spent on improving that whole area, but really pedestrianising it. If I could really wave a magic wand, I'd get rid of all the car parking down there, and just make it, if you want to get to the beach, you've got to catch the bus. That might mean building some car parks if people are having to travel further, but not actually on the beach frontage itself. Those things combined would make a huge difference to everybody's lives, both from a tourism perspective for businesses and for locals.
In terms of effective public transport, and I know public transport's not your area of expertise, but hear me out. It strikes me that there has been a lot of resistance from people who live at the beaches to extending rail down to the beaches. I mean, we have a railway station at Bondi Junction, and it doesn't go the extra probably 1 to 2 kilometres that it would take to go all to Bondi Beach. I've heard rumours that it actually does go a bit beyond Bondi Junction, but I don't know how far. If we were to say, we want to extend that so that you've got access, rail access, which is much more reliable and, if well patronised, a lot cheaper. But to actually say, all right, we are going to have these tunnelling worms that are going to be doing the Metro link out west, and then if the next project they were given would be to do a tunnel going all the way from even the Shire all the way to like Palm Beach, underneath all of the suburbs, under the head of the harbour, and disperse people across all the beaches. So people concerned about, well, my beach is going to get overrun. Well, no, because people can go to any of the beaches. To go and provide that immediate access and, improvements to mobility by doing a project like that. To you, again, not getting into the specifics of cost and public transport per se, but in terms of the picture of what could be created in livability for this city, would something like that, what change, would it make a big difference?
I think, so I have actually done a business case a number of years ago for Waverley Council around doing a light rail, or we looked at a whole range of options from getting from Bondi
tram.
That's basically, that was it. Yes, we looked at all sorts of options. And the problem is that those things need to be paid for largely, and so then the argument then was we've got to have a certain uplift in high rise in order to justify it, etc. And it didn't stack up. because people don't want there to be more development at Bondi Beach, and I understand that. It's actually already very high density.
Yes.
It's that it's at that sort of walk-up flat density.
Yeah.
I think though, so one option would be to extend the Bondi line, as you said, have a station at Bondi Beach and then loop it. So you don't, one of the problems with the Bondi line is that it goes backwards and forwards, so that does cause a logistic problem.
Yep.
And so one option would be to then continue it to cause a loop, perhaps coming back to the airport, so that you're then creating a line that is helps you much more with turning trains around. You're not having to come out to the junction and back again. So that could be a potential solution. As for things like connecting affluent suburbs together along the beachfront, I don't know that that's the best use of public money. I think that what I would do is build a high-speed rail. That is absolutely necessary for Australia.
Oh, we need to be for hours on high-speed rail.
And again, that's a project I've worked on in a couple of iterations now, including the current one. But really looking at getting from Brisbane to Sydney to Canberra to Melbourne on high-speed rail is an absolute no-brainer. At the moment, I've caught the train from Sydney to Melbourne. You're looking at 11 to 12 hours, no Wi-Fi.
You've got a little friend again.
That's right. No Wi-Fi, etc. I would spend the money on that rather than
Completely agree. No, absolutely. Look, we're running out of time, but wrapping up, I guess, I think this has been fantastic having a chat about all of the possibilities and the easy stuff, the logical stuff, the reasons why these things appear not to be happening at the moment, and building political will to make these kind of changes. One of the things that is going to drive this more than anything is people having a vision, having a picture in their mind of what things would look like if we did do the things that we were talking about today. And I see visions of, pedestrian precincts vastly more frequently around our suburbs, so that, there are malls and things without the need to go and have cars going down areas that make no sense, and people having that kind of livability, more parks and so on. But Sarah, to finish this off, do you want to draw a picture of what you see as being the nirvana? What would things look like if we had the political will to make some of these relatively simple changes? What would things look like in 5 or 10 years' time?
I think the first thing I would do is look at reducing the speeds that we have on local streets. So you might remember in the sort of 90s, they brought in when we went from having 60 kilometres an hour as the default urban speed limit to 50. And we went through no public consultation, and fatalities plummeted about 22% or something like that off the top of my head instantly. And we did no traffic calming, no community consultation, just came in state by state. And if you look at the statistics of road fatalities, very soon after every state brought it in. And likewise, we've brought in 40 kilometres an hour around school zones, for example. Now, if you look internationally at countries around the world, the ones that are achieving very, very good road safety statistics are the ones that are bringing 30 kilometres an hour. And the reason for 30 is that when you hit someone on the street at 50 kilometres an hour, there's around a 90 to 95% chance that they'll die. But if they're hit at 30, there's about a 5% chance they'll die.
Oh, wow.
It depends a little bit on the type of vehicle. The tall vehicles are more deadly because it hits the head.
Yeah.
But basically 30 kilometres an hour is considered to be a survivable speed for most people, and it's a very steep curve.
Yeah.
So I would say if I were sort of in the federal government, I would bring in, again, I'd say through the National Transport Commission, we need to have 30 kilometres an hour as the default urban speed limit, and then get the states then choose when they bring that in.
Yes.
But you would have a massive change to not just the fatalities on our roads, which have been going up recently, but you'd also get a huge improvement in quality of life. So
Right.
Wales did exactly that about 18 months ago. And people are connecting more with their local neighbours.
Yeah.
It's because the street's calmer and quieter. You can cross the street and meet your neighbour without worrying about getting hit by a car.
Wow.
So it's creating this greater congeniality amongst the street. And people are finding driving is less stressful. So when they're then moving from to other parts of the UK and driving, they're saying, actually, this is weird, but I feel more stressed driving in a faster driving environment. So I think that that would be something you could do that with this next term of government instantly across Australia and have a huge impact on people's lives. Now people will hate it on day one. In Wales they had something like 500,000 people out of a population of 6 million signed a petition in complaint. But if you ask them to sign it today, most of those people probably wouldn't be signing that petition. So that's what I would do. I'd say that is going to make a massive difference. I'd also looking at, things like closing down streets and opening them to the public and so on. So that would be my dream.
Fantastic, wonderful. Sarah, thank you so much for your time today. It's been absolutely wonderful having a chat. We've covered a lot of ground. We'll have you back to talk about high-speed rail, one of my pet areas indeed. And no, look, that's been fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me.
Wonderful.
Authorised by Acroft for the Greens, New South Wales, Sydney.